The sun has left and forgotten me. It's dark, I cannot
Your stories don't
see.
define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief storymaker at Elkins Consulting. By now, you know that this conversation is going to be an organic conversation, sharing stories, trying to understand more about who we are and what makes us tick. And if you've been listening for any length of time, you know that your stories offer an glimpse into who you are for other people. But what most people don't really understand is that their stories also give them information and evidence for their internal messages, for better and for worse. So the most important thing about your stories and how you share them is to know and be intentional about how you want to experience yourself and how others will experience you through your story. I'd like to welcome our guest today, Chase Dalton. He's calling in from Salt Lake City, Utah, and we already got started on a bit of a conversation about the fictions that surround where we live. Usually fictions come from fictional characters, movies, TV shows, and of course, the show Yellowstone came up about Montana. And I just know, listeners, you are going to enjoy the stories that Chase has to share with us. Chase, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. So, well, let's jump in. As you know, because you had that prep document, I love to start the conversation by asking my guests to share something about themselves that most people probably don't know about them, something not on their bio or their LinkedIn profile. And I love our listeners to get just this glimpse again into your story so that they have more context and we can see you throughout our conversation as a multidimensional person. So,
yeah,
where should we go from here?
Well, something that, I don't talk about a whole lot, publicly or privately. And so it's a little bit of a coming out party here for me, publicly is, I guess some people can infer I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, and if you look at a LinkedIn profile, you might see BYU, as my alma mater. But I was raised in an LDS faith, very staunch, orthodox, however you want to put it, very conservative, religious upbringing. And for people who are familiar, it's there's a reputation, with that, and a lot of unknowns and things like that. And it's also more than just, a lot of times it's more than just a religion or a belief. There's really a culture and that comes along with it, and an identity. And over the last few years, or a few years ago, I decided to step away from that, and it's been a huge defining thing for me to step away from my tribe, my community, my family, especially still living here in Salt Lake City, and to sort of redefine who I am and what my morals are, what my values are, and what I stand for, and who am I outside of that? Where do I end and the church starts, or the other way around? And so, yeah, it's something that, especially here in my community, it's not a very celebrated topic. Kind of looked down on. And so we try to, and I'm also privileged enough to sort of present as Mormon in a way, so I can fit in.
You can fit in if you want to.
If I need to, right? And so I recognize that privilege there, but also it's been a interesting time for me. And I love the person who I am and who I've become, through finding who I am as an individual, and what that means to my family and everything. And so, but yeah, there are a lot of preconceived notions about what that means, and that people, like we just talked about, I live in Salt Lake City, so that means I have 4 wives and 500 kids, and I
the fictions
on Sunday, and and
Oh
maybe
my
I don't
gosh.
dance or drink soda or whatever the common, misconceptions are out there. But yeah, that's something that is a big part of me that well, now you and all your listeners know, outside of a couple handfuls of people.
Wow, Chase, I know you're chuckling. Our listeners can't see your big smile as you're talking about this. And I'm hearing it from this place of joy and release. And I'm also hearing this edge of grief. That's hard. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you sharing that, partly because I know how hard it is to split off from all that you've known, all that you've experienced. And to be able to talk about it is just, it's courageous. And it may not feel like that to you, but from an outsider who has seen that separation from, as you described, the tribe, that's a big deal. That's a really big deal.
Yeah. It's time heals a lot. And it's been a few years now. And so I've been able to, separate a little bit and have it make it be easier to talk about. But you're right. And it's really receptive of you to point that out. Like it is exciting and it is freeing, but there's also, a grief of a past life almost, of what I imagined what my life would be like and the direction it was going to go in. And even beyond that, right? Like I had it all figured out. I knew exactly
Right. You had
what I
all
was
the
going to do
answers.
after I died, even, as well.
Right.
And now there's a giant question mark, for everything, and learning to be okay with that and be okay with the unknown, and it has been an interesting part of my story. Yeah.
No kidding. Well, in some ways, it's the easier path to just stay with it. I think about that. I met somebody when I worked with the city here in Helena, when I was mentioning that I had this sense of my father's presence after he died. And I was saying something about he just didn't seem at peace. My father was bipolar. So
Mm.
he never was at peace necessarily through his life, except when he was holding his grandchildren when they were babies. I could
Oh,
definitely see a different side of him that I don't think he had been able to explore before that.
wow.
But I remember thinking about how different it was to have this experience of him not being at peace after his death. And I was saying something, I don't even know why I was talking to this particular person about this, but everything was close to the surface after he died. Of course, I was grieving. But I remember this man saying, well, I'm a Christian and I believe in purgatory and heaven and hell. And he said, it's just easier that way. And at that moment, I had to take a breath because I felt like a little judgy toward him. What do you mean it's just easier that way? Like, what about all the questions? Why would you take the easy route? It's so like, but you don't, what? And I had that edge of judgment. And then seconds later, I felt this sense of calm come over me because I realized for so many people, life is so complicated. You have so many questions. Life is hard. To be able to set aside that part to say, okay, I have the answers to those questions. So that's off the table. That's off my plate. I don't have to think about it. It's already decided. I can
Yeah.
imagine the comfort and peace that brings to people. So to give that up, again, I hear you is all I'm going to say about that topic again.
Yeah. No, it can be terrifying, and from being a little antagonistic is that I've heard religion referred to as the opiate of the masses, right? It does
Mm-hmm.
it calms anxieties of what death and purpose on life, what we're doing here, and where did we come from, um and but through time, science has sort of explained some of those unexplainable things, but there's still some things that it hasn't,
Right. That we'll never
like
understand.
right. But yeah, I think that's a really, that's a valiant way to look at things, a very empathetic way to look at things. Like, hey, life's hard enough. It's okay to kind of rest on our haunches about some things.
And exactly. As long as it's not damaging other people. or proselytizing to other people. I think it's a beautiful way of finding comfort and peace in a really hard and uncertain time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I've come out of this a much more compassionate person, because I was on the other side of that. I was on the judgy, I know everything, like I'm living the right way and you're not, side of that. And so I can have some space and compassion for those who are still there saying, like, that's not it. Like, and also I'm not also not saying you have to give up your religion, no matter what it is, to find that. Like, there is a place where they can coexist. It didn't for me, and that's just my experience. But it can, and it should. That should be something we work toward. And if you look at any great religious leader or God of whatever that you believe in, there's always that space for compassion and understanding and empathy. And sometimes I think we extrapolate on that a little bit too much in our zeal.
Totally agree. Wow. Well, this got off to a completely unexpected start, and I'm so glad, and I'm really grateful that you shared that. So I know we're going to end up coming back to that, because at some point I'm going to want to know how this happened. And that may not come up in this conversation, but maybe it will. But what I'd like to know is, now that you're in this different place and you have this business, when you think about what you're doing right now, the impact you're having through your business and the work that you do, can you tell a story about a recent experience at work, a client that you had that made you realize that you were in the right place at the right time, that this is where you were supposed to be? Because you just glossed over this idea of purpose when you were talking about giving up that comfort of religion to that extent. So without telling me what you do, you're going to tell me what you do.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Because if you were to review our core purpose or our core values of our business, they don't mention the product that we sell or even come close to it. Because that doesn't have anything to do with anything. It doesn't get you out of bed. It doesn't give you, energy or purpose or, vision at all. I really believe, getting to this point in my life and certain experience I've had, that relationships are the driving force of everything in life. In some way, we can always tie it back to our relationships, whether it be with yourself or with family or friends or a deity or whatever. It's going to stem back to a relationship. It's the reason why we do everything that we do. Hopefully, it's just finding the right relationships to pour that energy into. I'm far enough in the business now to where I don't interact a whole lot with clients, and so I actually view my employees as my clients. Or did I say that right? Yeah.
Yes, that is refreshing. Okay. So tell me about an employee that you had an interaction with that was like, oh, yes, this was so satisfying.
Yeah. I recently just had a quarterly review with one of our managers, and I was helping him understand what his role was as a manager, because he's an incredible technician, and he's a great supervisor, and he's a hard worker. But we're getting to this point where I'm trying to build him as a leader, so that he can do what I'm trying to do in his realm. And so we're having this conversation about, and we had that same conversation. Why are you here? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing this for? And I don't tell me it's for money. Like, I know that we have to do what we have to do to make it, to pay rent and whatever, to buy food. But what are you doing? What gets you out of bed? And again, he talked about his wife and not wanting her to be able to come home and spend more time with their kids instead of work, and having opportunities for his daughter that maybe he didn't have growing up, and time, time to spend and growth. He wants to grow. And, I don't know if it's helpful to go too much into the specifics of exactly what we talked about, but you asked, what is it that I do, and why do I do it? Him leaving that meeting with just it seemed like he was 6 inches taller with just a light, saying like, I'm doing more than just building plastic and metal signs. I'm changing the world in my little way. He has 5 or 6 or 7 people that he manages, and he was so excited to go on and have that conversation with them to find out what makes you tick and how can I help. How can this business help you get there rather than the other way around? And feeling like I'm not just a supervisor. I'm not just a technician. I can be a leader and I can make a difference. Man, that was better than any $1 million sale I've ever made. As far as how I felt afterwards, like, yeah, I'm making a difference in one person's life, and it can spread out from there. And if I can do that in my little sphere of influence, and if we all could try to do that in our sphere of influence and realize that we do make an impact, it's really rewarding to be in a position of power, which is a huge responsibility, and to be able to use that in a way that I feel is productive and positive. Be on the side of the force.
The good side. Oh my gosh. I wish our listeners could see our smiles right now, because like my cheeks are aching. I'm smiling so big because all of what you're saying, these are all things that I've been talking about for at least 10 or 15 years. The circle of people that I have in my close connections through LinkedIn and even here in Montana are all talking about this and have been talking about this, but it's rare to see it in action. So to hear your story of satisfaction coming from watching your manager walk out of the room feeling full of purpose and meaning in what he does beyond metal and plastic is just, first of all, it's so refreshing, but there's so much more to it. It's making my heart warm. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's really meaningful to hear that. So now our listeners are probably super curious about what you actually produce to your company. So why don't you just give them a little heads up?
It's really not exciting. It's signs. There's a little backdrop there. We're just a sign manufacturer. So we do make plastic and metal and lights, and we hang it on.
Just a sign manufacturer.
We're just a sign manufacturer.
Oh, you have to remove just from that sentence. I mean, and here are 2 reasons. When you say just a sign manufacturer, you are dismissing, first of all, the creativity and artistry that goes into that, because you're turning and bending metal and tubes and putting wires in and creating something that represents something that really is meaningful to a person. So for instance, I'm thinking about this new food truck that just came out in Helena, Montana a few months ago. It's called Habana 406, because 406 is our area code for the whole state of Montana. It's the only area code right now. And it has been, and people just fight tooth and nail to keep it that way. Yeah. But Habana 406, it's a Cuban food truck. To a couple and their 2 daughters, young daughters that immigrated here to Montana and experienced extreme discrimination. And they are some of the most kind and generous souls that you could ever meet. And they moved here, they settled in here. They were trying to make do with jobs because they got their green cards, and they were trying to make things work and raising their daughters here. And finally, somebody helped them start this food truck to sell Cuban food, which is, they're phenomenally talented cooks. Like, I've eaten their foods for years, and now I get to go buy it and support them in this way. Their sign, Havana 406, the signs that are attached, the artwork that's attached to that truck, that's not just a sign to them, right? Yeah. And what you're providing through your work and your company and people who care about what they do because they understand the meaning of their work, because you are leading it, that's not just a sign to the person
All
who's
right.
ordering it.
All right, fine. You got me. And you're right. And I do have a lot more meaning than just the plastic and metal. We work with a lot of franchises across the country. We've done work in all 50 states actually. And so we worked with a ton of small business owners. And these are people who they didn't just have millions of dollars to invest. They mortgaged their homes, or emptied their 401ks, or reinvested an inheritance, or emptied out a kid's college fund. But in most cases, they at the very least personally guaranteed a loan to build out a new restaurant or something, and which means if it goes under, they lose
everything,
their livelihoods. Yeah, and so there's a lot of anxiety, of course. And we're one of the first things to go up. We try to be, very early on. And so, they're in an extreme amount of debt. It's really stressful. They're trying to do 100 things before they open, hire employees and do construction and insurance and point of sale and order inventory, whatever. It's really cool to see almost a monkey lift off their back when they see the sign go up, the amount of pride that they have when it becomes real. And this is like, oh my gosh, like, this is going to work. Like, this is happening. That's my brand. And maybe this wasn't all for nothing. And so there, yes, we're doing more than that. What a sign can represent is an investment in risk and a hope for a better future for small business, entrepreneurs. And that part is pretty rewarding to see that.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because it's meaningful to me. I remember even the first time I got my own business cards for my own business.
So much pride.
And yes. And handing them out to my mom, right? Like, Mom, look at my new business card. And there is something so powerful about seeing your label, your brand in lights, especially. I don't have anything Elkins Consulting Inc. in lights. But maybe that's something I should be looking at.
Yeah, this is a picture of our building there.
Well, I'll do a screenshot at the end of this, and we'll include it in the show notes associated with the podcast on the website. Yeah. That way our listeners can get a glimpse. If you go to elkinsconsulting.com, listeners, you'll see Chase's contact information, as well as the links to Silicon Signs, the name of his business. And hopefully, if I can, look presentable for even just a moment, we can do a screenshot to include in that. So coming back around, I'm just loving the way that this conversation is taking interesting turns. When you left the church, were you already the owner of this business? Where were you in terms of your career when you left?
Yeah, I was the owner of this business. We'd been around for a few years, 2 or 3 years at this point. And I almost left the business. I talked to my business partner and I told him what I was dealing with. And I almost, I was about an inch away from signing a contract to open a few Crumble Cookies restaurants out in Baltimore. So me and my wife had already gone out there. We negotiated leases. We'd found a place to live. And I got down to actually signing the contract with Crumble. And so I told my business partner, I was like, hey, I'm going to go do this. It's something I feel like I need to do. And he was like, okay. I was like, I'll do whatever I can remotely. But he was pretty understanding. He was like, all right, well, I guess we'll see what happens. I got really close when it came down to, signing the contract. I just, had a bad gut feeling about it. And this is a huge, learning experience for me as well. Because a lot of times, you have these gut feelings, and when other people are involved and you feel like you're letting people down, a lot of times, at least in my experience, we just go through with it. And then we can always look back and be like, oh, I knew it. I knew I should have done that.
Yeah. Why didn't I trust myself? Right.
Yeah. And whatever you attribute that feeling to, whether it's, the Holy Spirit,
divinity,
or your experience, or Mother Earth, or whatever, there's something there. There's some it's hard to, there's some unexplainable power, whether it's a God or not, that kind of help us with those intuitions and everything. But this is one of those times where I felt so, it felt so empowering to just say, no, I'm not going to do this, and to turn down the contract and to tell everybody I was working with and the brokers and everybody say, hey, we changed our minds. But ultimately what it came down to is I was running away. I wanted to get away. I didn't want to face my family. I didn't want to face my friends. I wanted to go do this and figure this out away from everybody. And then maybe I'd come back in a few years, and then it'd be far. I just knew it would be far enough away that I would just be like, yeah, I left, and you're going to have to deal with it. But instead I had to navigate that, piece by piece, and conversation by conversation with family members and friends who are sad and disappointed and confused. But yeah.
Wow. What that just said to me, that whole story, is that whatever you left behind, you did not leave behind your sense of integrity that was built into you through those years. Whatever it is you left, that stayed intact. And I think about this in that whole nature versus nurture stuff. Was that just part of you? Were you born with that integrity, with that sense of facing the music when you make a decision? Or was that something that your parents raised you with, and the community of the church that helped raise you? And it doesn't really matter where it came from. But I think to be able to honor that part of you that came out of that upbringing, regardless of what happens into the future, I think that's really important.
Yeah. I feel, my parents did raise me, not just, through the tenets of the church, but my dad taught me a lot of life lessons. I mean, specifically about taking responsibility for actions, and being honest no matter what. And honesty isn't just telling the truth to other people. Honesty is something that's inside. You have to be honest with yourself before you can ever be honest with anybody else. And part of that is just accepting your stripes, your licks when you messed up or whatever. And but yeah, I've always felt a pull to just do what's right in that moment. Some people ask me, well, do you regret, going on a mission? Right? I went on a 2-year mission to Arizona, went after my first year of college, and actually had a really successful athletic career. In high school, I did really well. I got a scholarship to BYU as a decathlete on the track team. And I was an All-American there 3 times. I made after my freshman year, I won the junior national championships for the decathlon. I went to world championships for the US. I placed 11th there.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I left on a mission a few months later. And I was out for 2 years. I didn't compete. I didn't stay in shape. I was just out proselyting and, as missionaries do. And I came back, and it took me a long time to get back. And I never fully did get back to where I should have been. I mean, the people I was at the world championships with were, most of them were at the Olympics. And that was my childhood dream. I want to be at the Olympics. I have it written down in journals from when I was, 10 years old. I want to be an Olympian and win a gold medal. And so a lot of people ask me, even people outside of the church, like, hey, do you regret going on a mission? Because you could draw a pretty straight line between me not achieving my Olympic dream to going on a mission. It doesn't, It's not a huge leap.
No, it broke up your training, like at a critical time for it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. But my answer, I had to think about that. And my answer is no, I don't. And the reason why is because even though I don't believe what I was teaching and proselyting to other people, in some ways I even can look back and say, maybe I was doing harm in that moment. But in the moment, I felt like I was doing my duty and what I felt was truly right, not for anybody else. Right. I sacrificed a lot. This wasn't just like this pressure to go on because everyone's going to, think I'm a bad person if I don't. It's like I had a lot to give up. And if I wouldn't have gone, nobody would have, a lot of people would have understood, be like, well, of course he's training for the Olympics. He's one of the best athletes we have to offer, from the country. But I went because it's like, this is what I'm doing for myself, for my God. And I felt like I was doing what was right then. And I have to give grace to myself, my past self, for that. And even to my current self, to my future self, is if I can always try to just do what I feel like is right in the moment, then it's going to be it's going to be easy not to live with a ton of regret. And obviously I have some regrets. There's things that I've done wrong, but they're always tied to, I did it wrong when I knew it was wrong. I made the wrong choice on purpose. And those are the things that I regret. I hurt this person and I knew I shouldn't have. But I've never regretted something that I thought I was doing right. I just can learn from there and know that I've grown.
I love that. There's so much in that short story. And I came back immediately to not having regret for something that you believed at the time was the right thing to do. And you truly believed it in your heart, or you wouldn't have done it. And I know that because of the story about not moving to Baltimore. So clearly you have a sense of what is right for you at any given time. And I would love to remind our listeners too, that regret really comes from not understanding the lessons that you have to learn from it. So when I was in my 40s, I finally figured out what I wanted to do. And I'm still exploring that in my 50s. But I remember saying something to a friend who was in her late 60s at the time. I said, I'm finally figuring out what I'm really good at and how I can make a positive impact. I just wish I had figured this out 5 years ago or longer. Like, why did it take me so long? And she said, Sarah, you couldn't be where you are now without those experiences. You couldn't offer the insights and help and excellent listening that you do now if you hadn't had those experiences of struggle and learning all those different things along the way. If you regret that, you're dismissing the lessons that you learned from it and the potential for helping others now that you've experienced it.
Yeah. There's really no substitute for time and experience. We all just have to do our time. It really comes down to that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So Chase, let's pull this full circle back to this whole experience of doing things that seemed like the right thing at the time. You mentioned earlier, I just kind of want to end with this story that you told me before we hit record about your time in Billings, Montana, that you had come up to work with a friend's father's company. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Just a quick description of that.
I went out to sell pest control one summer and realized about a month into it that I hate it. I was doing terrible at it, which is funny because I'm still in sales now, but I just hated bugging people and knocking on their door at night and taking them away for dinner to sell them pest control that they didn't even need probably. And so I called up my old roommate and said, "Hey, you got a spot for me?" He's like, "Yeah, come on out." Went out to Billings, Montana. And his dad had an asbestos abatement company. And so we'd go out and do these projects, whether it was a hospital or an old school, and we'd zip up our Tyvek suits and block off all the air. And sometimes we were in boiler rooms and attics, sitting in Montana summers. And it was hard work. We work 16, 18, 20 hours a day sometimes to just knock out the project. And then we'd have a week after that to go play and go horseback riding and swimming and fishing and all that. So I had a great time in Montana. I'd go back in a heartbeat.
Yeah, it sounds like an amazing summer. And so when you think about that summer, what's the image that popped into your head? Because as you were telling the story, I was imagining the Tyvek suits in an attic and a couple standing outside of the house, just like pulling, biting their nails, wondering what's happening in that attic. That was like the image that popped into my head. So what is your image when you think of it? Is it the fishing and exploring, or is it like the actual work and the people that were impacted by the work you were doing?
No, I usually remember things better than they happened. If I think hard enough, I'll remember, sitting in a pool of my sweat inside of that Tyvek suit. But no, I think of being out in a boat on the Yellowtail Reservoir, I think is what it was, and cliff jumping and spear fishing. And yeah, I remember the good stuff.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, that makes life so much more fun. Either. No, of course not. And it made you who you are today. There are so many aspects of what you learned as a human being in those situations. And again, it just comes back to having compassion for others when you have been there. You've walked in those shoes in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a fun summer.
I love it. Chase, this has been such a treat. I am pleased and kind of overwhelmed at the direction this conversation took. I'm going to listen to it. I don't always listen to the podcast episodes after they're recorded because I like to live in this moment of being in the conversation. But I'm going to listen to this one because I know that there are pieces that I missed because I was listening for particular questions. And I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this. Love what you're doing here too. This is a good thing, a good undertaking to spread stories and to share stories. That's the best way to get information, to consume information in a story. Textbooks are overrated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there are times, of course, there's a time and a place for it, but yeah. I think the critical factor here in these conversations is that everyone realizes that their stories really matter, and that if somebody is listening and they've done something similar, but they don't feel like they have any important stories to share, hearing your stories will trigger their stories, and they'll start to remember those critical parts of their lives, the pivot points that helped them discover something new about themselves or realize that their purpose was different from what they had anticipated. And it brings me great joy, and it's such an honor to hold space for those stories.
Yeah. Keep it up. It's awesome.
Thank you. So for our listeners, you can follow Chase Dalton. He has all the links to find him are going to be in the podcast show notes at elkinsconsulting.com for this episode. The company is called Silicon Signs. It's out of Salt Lake City, but they ship all over the country. And I hope you'll look him up and learn a little bit more about this really interesting, thoughtful, and compassionate man. Thanks for listening. Listeners, it's your turn. Think about a time where you made a complete 180, where maybe you had to grieve the loss of certain relationships in order to move on as yourself, to find that separation between who you were based on your parents, your upbringing, your environment, and finding that maybe those influences aren't all of who you are. Send me a quick note. Let me know if you find your pivotal moment, or 2 or 3, and share them with me. Thanks for listening.
Smile, what's the use of crying?